One of the things that happened the other night when I was out with friends was I briefly told a little story from my life about how years and years ago, when I was about 19 or 20, I met a man online and ran away to live with him in Sydney. And, you know, what I don't fully explain when I typically tell that story is that actually and people sometimes say, oh, you were like the prodigal son. And I think, no, not really, because the prodigal son was running away from a perfectly good home in order to enjoy, worldly pleasures. I was not. From my perspective, I was running away from abuse at home to be with Prince Charming, and I thought I was going to get married and live happily ever after, and have my own family where I would, raise my kids differently from how I'd been raised. And, I thought that was going to be my life. But then when I got to Sydney, the man deflowered me and then refused to marry me. And I was, I stuck around as long as I did because I thought, well, if I stick around long enough, eventually he has to break down and marry me as he originally said he would. So, in the end, I would somehow be exonerated for the choices I'd made. Because a lot of people back home didn't know, I think, or understand, and I think I still don't fully understand that I was being abused in home. Um, you know, uh, my mother had once told me, if the law didn't require it, I wouldn't even allow you to go to school. I would keep you tied to a chair night and day to keep you safe. And, another thing she used to do was to tell me that my main reason for going to university was to find a man to marry, that I shouldn't expect a career. And when I would get a job, she would tell me, oh, the boss is just hiring you to sexually harass you or sell you into prostitution. Uh, you know, so, and back then I was too young to know what was real and what wasn't away from what she was telling me. So I knew something was wrong. I knew something was wrong because I found that peers who I did interact with didn't seem to be living the same kind of life. And when my parents had me watch television extensively instead of going out and socializing to the extent that someone my age typically would. And on TV, I could again see that the life I was living didn't really resemble anything I was seeing on television, except in cases where it was a murder documentary and they were describing the childhood of a serial killer or someone, who's been horribly abused otherwise. And I sort of realized, okay, there is something wrong here. And I knew it from a very young age, really. Onwards of about age 4 or 5, I kind of knew that I was done with my family and wanted to leave. But because it was a long time ago, this was happening around 2007. Back then, child abuse was not taken quite as seriously, and so there was a much greater tendency, I think, to assume that if a child is saying that they're having problems at home, that they aren't actually being abused, that they're just being a disobedient child and they need to learn to be more grateful. And so when I would go around asking people for help, I'd talk to the school counselor, I'd talk to, people older than me at church. Everyone had this tendency to take the stance of, oh, it's not that bad, Shona. Your situation's totally normal. And worse yet, there were people who tried to tell me that if I could just be a better daughter, um, that that if I was just a better daughter, my mother would stop abusing me, that she would get better. Which, it was not true at all. In fact, typically, if I tried to reconcile with her and to be a more good and obedient daughter, the abuse just got worse. And the abuse ranged. I mean, thankfully, she stopped beating me when I was fairly young, because she had heard a story about someone who used to beat their son constantly, and then one day the son, took up the same whip and beat their parent with it. And so she became very fearful that I would one day become strong enough to retaliate. And so the abuse was largely verbal, and it was largely about controlling the resources and environment of the house. Disrespect of personal property. So sometimes I would come home and find that she had destroyed my possessions, or hidden them from me, or even just completely rearranged my room in a way that made it unusable to me. And, you know, there was also, yeah, there was a lot of psychological abuse. There was the way she would be constantly accusing me of things that I wasn't actually doing. Coming to my door in the middle of the night to tell me off for doing those things, holding a Bible in her hands, reading verses out of it in a very accusatory manner at me. There was, the ongoing thing of how she would, like she and I might sit and watch TV together, and she'd say, see that bad thing that man is doing, the way he's, being with that woman and then abandoning her. That's what men do. But at the same time, she was putting immense pressure on me to marry. So I had these two contradictory messages of, if you want to be a fully fledged, successful woman, you have to marry. And if you want, but if you marry, the man will inevitably treat you poorly. And run away, probably. And so I grew up hearing this over and over and over again, and as far as I knew, it was reality, So when I finally met a man on the internet who actually was talking to me as though he wanted to marry me, I thought, great, and you might say, well, Shona, if you really just wanted to get away from your family, why didn't you get a job and move out? Well, it is partly that they really they had really worn me down into a state where I didn't feel that I could apply for a job successfully. And even insofar as I would try, I would typically go into the interviews and have such a hellish time, imagining a lot of horrible things and answering the questions in such a poor way, and that I was very much deterred from really trying. And more than that, there was just an overarching sense of hopelessness. This is something people don't typically understand about abuse. What makes it abuse isn't really any one action. It's this larger campaign that leaves the person feeling incompetent and deflated, and like they can't, like even if they tried to get away, they would just fail anyhow, so there's no point in trying. And more than that, I had been raised Christian. I had been, and so throughout my life, whenever I tried to resist my parents on anything that I could tell was not the right thing for them to be asking me to do, the reaction was, Shona, if the Bible says honor your father and mother, obey your father and mother, if you want to obey us, you have to do what we say. If you want to honor us, you can't tell anyone about what we're doing. And, you have to just, accept it and be a good daughter and do whatever we tell you. Be quiet, and it was just, it was just a ridiculous life of being forever trapped in the house, except for school and church and going shopping with my family again. And there were times when I would say to my parents, I need to stay home and study, and my mother would punish me for saying that, saying, oh, but your father wants you to go shopping with us, And so I had to live with getting poor grades. And then there was a time when I did succeed in convincing them to let me stay home to study. And, I finished studying before they returned. And we had rented some DVDs from the local video store, so I sat down and started watching one of the ones that I had picked out. And they came home and saw this and accused me of pretending to study. And you might think, oh, that's a one-off incident. No, my entire childhood was like that of my mother seeing me do something and accusing me of doing something far worse over and over and over again. That was my whole life. And so I think it's, and I think people tend to assume, oh, but besides that, your parents must have treated you with normal kindness and affection, right? No, no. E- Even by the time they would be at all affectionate to me, it was usually in an effort to convince me that that something wrong that they were asking me to do was right. Was to convince me that something abusive or controlling that they had said to me was not that bad. It was never really from a place of really caring about the way that I felt or what I needed or who I was on the inside. Um, so when this opportunity came to get away and be with someone far, far away who would, let me stay in their home, and I wouldn't have to pay rent unless I was capable of it. I would just have to contribute to living expenses. I thought, great, I'll do this, I'll finally have some sort of normal life. And again, you have to remember that I was very isolated and naive, So I got there thinking that I was going to be fine, but I wasn't fine. I was quite mentally ill. And worse yet, so was the guy. There were times when he would, when I found the bong in the garage, the bottle bong he had made, he initially acted very repentant and sorry that I had found it, sorry that he had been smoking marijuana. He really seemed like he wanted to quit. But then later on when I talked with him about quitting, he guffawed in my face and acted like I was an idiot for expecting it of him. And, or every time his father would say anything to him about, express any disagreement with my presence in the home, the guy wouldn't stick up for me. He would start screaming and yelling at me that the situation was my fault. He'd put immense pressure on me to find a job, which, to some extent was reasonable because, of course, I had to contribute to living expenses. But then he wouldn't allow me to do any of the things I needed to do in order to get work. He wouldn't let me sew, so I couldn't make money that way. He wouldn't, he didn't want to, when I would go to apply for jobs, and he would be like, no, don't do that. That person's just going to sexually abuse you in their home. And, if I, and I was very distressed over the way he was treating me. And, I've talked about this in another video because, people, used to always ask the question, why do victims stay with the abuser? And, I described the relationship at length in that video. But, it has to be said that it was a confusing time as well, because he'd sometimes be threatening me with a knife or shaking me down for drug money, or even sexually assaulting me. And then other times he would be teaching me how to make mee goreng or packing me a lunch when I would find work and be able to go there. And, but yeah, there was abuse relating to money, in that even during times where he would be working and I would be the one on Centrelink, he would still end up borrowing money from me to cover his drug addiction, to cover his marijuana addiction. And, yeah, so again, it was a very miserable time in my life, and, it has to be said that, I still was under the impression that the only reason it would be okay for me to disobey my parents was if I had a husband who would, who I would have to obey instead. So when I found that this relationship wasn't working, I naturally began to think, well, maybe I'm just with the wrong man. But, because this man had already deflowered me and I was a Christian, I didn't feel that it was okay for me to leave. I felt that I had to stick with this guy no matter what, and until he married me, and I just had to hope and pray that over time he would abuse me less, or that I would find some way of coping with the abuse. But again, any of the things that I came up with to help me cope with the abuse, he was not amicable to. He was not contented to allow me to go out and take some time alone when I needed to cool down, for example, after a really bad fight. Let me pause for a sec. He wasn't contented to let me talk to anyone to get help for any of the problems we were having. He wasn't, again, he wasn't going to let me journal about my problems, which back then was like my main, way of coping with my mental health issues, my depression and my anxiety and so on. And, he was not, he wasn't really letting me have any of the basic freedoms or access to any of the things I would have used to cope. In fact, if I stayed up late watching television while he and his father were sleeping, he would tell me off. If I stayed up wanting to read, he would tell me off. No matter what you know what I mean? There was a freakish amount of control that he wanted to have over my life. And, there were moments where he would express regret over the level of control. But, yeah, ultimately the regret didn't go anywhere. Ultimately, it was still a case of him getting whatever he wanted and ignoring my needs at the same time. And, there was one rare good thing he did for me, which was he gave me Yoshi. He was actually the one who bought Yoshi for me because he could tell that I was not coping well. He could tell that I felt very alone and isolated. The church I was going to at the time was a toxic church, let's be honest. Admittedly, back then I was a toxic person, so even if they had been really nice people, I probably would have had a tough time getting along with them. But the majority of the young people there just didn't understand where I was coming from and just saw me as being this, annoying new person who's kind of rude and commits debauchery and can't cope and handle anything. And, because again, back then abuse wasn't so well understood by society, mental illness wasn't so well understood. So the responses that I got when I would try to talk to people about my life were largely unsympathetic. And, again, this was one of the things that kept me trapped, the sensation of, well, society is expecting me to be abused, so I guess I just have to stay here. What got me freed, and I'd been praying a long time that God would rescue me. I prayed for a long time that God would give me some way out. And eventually, God gave me a way out. The church I had been going to had a weekend of 2 days activities in one row. The pastor was celebrating his his anniversary with his wife on the Saturday, and then regular church on the Sunday. And it was already the case that the boyfriend did not like the amount of control not control, but the extent to which church was changing me, and the extent to which I wanted to be there more and invest more of myself there. He didn't like that because I think he could tell it meant that he had less control over how I felt and what was going on with me. And so, me wanting to go to church 2 days in a row infuriated him. And he basically told me that he didn't want me around anymore. So I was like, great. And I make it sound casual. Actually, I was screaming my head off for about half the time I was packing my things. But, I was packing a bunch of my stuff in boxes and bags and calling my church friends for help. And, they came and the boyfriend verbally abused me in front of them. So classy. And, but yeah, I got away and I started to have a life of my own. Now, bizarrely, even after this occurred, I stayed in contact with that boyfriend and even, occasionally would sleep over at his house because, I was still an old-fashioned romantic and I still wanted to believe that somehow things between me and him would work out. But, the way that I understood scripture at the time was that I could only justify going back to him if he became a Christian. And, you know, because I understood it to be a case of divorce, and I understood it to be a case of, well, of it being like what it says in the Bible, where if a Christian woman is married to a non-Christian man and then the Christian man kicks her out, the non-Christian man kicks her out, she's free to do what she wants, but only in the Lord. And so I understood that to mean, okay, it's alright for me to be with somebody else on the proviso that they are a Christian. And, so the only way I was ever going to be with him again is if he became one. And that was that really helped me to never go back to him in the relationship, because of course it would have been tempting because he was the only person in Sydney who I knew really well. Everyone at home had thought that I was just running away to be debaucherous and whorish. And, so I didn't feel like I could, or at least that was how I perceived the situation. So I didn't feel that I could come home. And, yeah, so, I for a period of time, I worked different jobs. It was around the time of the GFC all of this was happening, so no matter what job I ever had, I was always being underpaid really badly, even by the standards of those times. And, I was always struggling to look after myself. I was having to borrow money from home, and, people from home were putting immense pressure on me to just come back. Just come back, Shona, just come back. Which I really didn't want to do because I knew if I went back, there was a good chance the abuse would get worse rather than better. And in fact, some of the relatives I had been quite manipulative and saying, well, if you don't want to have to listen to us, then why do you keep accepting money from us? And, if you don't, as if accepting a gift of money when you're in trouble necessarily means that you now owe that person your whole life, which is, of course, ridiculous. But I didn't have that level of perspective back then. I took on so much of the stress and pressure that these people were putting on me, and it was emotionally and mentally exhausting. I couldn't really keep a job very well for over the long run, partly because, again, it was GFC times, and typically the only jobs available were truly horrible for one reason or another. And those are stories I could tell another time, but I think people don't really get that, victims of abuse are not operating with all of the advantages that a normal person has psychologically. It's like psychologically, most people know you can just go get a job and, you'll work it out. But that's the thing. A lot of people who've been through abuse have been taught their whole lives that they have nothing to offer, that they are just completely incompetent, that everything they try will just fail, that every effort they make to improve their life will be for nothing. And, to get as far as I have in my life, as far as having an online store and all of that, I had to work really hard to try to function despite what I'd been taught. And there were people who I had to meet in my life who to teach me that actually this kind of hopeless thinking wasn't true, that actually it was more natural to have a sense of hope. Some of those people were a boyfriend that I had a number of years ago. A different boyfriend, of course, from the one in the story. He and his family did a lot to teach me about positivity and about optimism and about just basic life skills of try this, be okay with the possibility of failing, because failing means you can learn, which is not something I was taught in childhood. What my parents had me believing is don't try, because you'll probably fail. And if you've tried something and failed, it's proof that you will just fail later, over and over again, and you will never get anywhere. And so I think my purpose in making this video is just, I think people don't fully understand how important it is to be patient and empathetic with people who have been through abuse. Because throughout the bulk of my life, like, this ability that I have to just talk about what I went through was gone, because all of my abusers had me fully convinced that if I ever talked about the abuses that they had committed, that I was doing something wrong, that I was doing something even worse than the abuse itself, which of course, again, is preposterous, but that is the true power of abuse. It isn't just that they treat the abuse victim poorly, it's that they convince the abuse victim that not only are they getting what they deserve, but that they rob the abuse victim of the mental and emotional ability, and in some cases the physical ability, to do any of the normal things a person would do to rescue themselves out of the abuse. You know, and yeah, just even the ability to articulate what my experiences as abuse it represents progress, because I spent a very long time feeling that I was equally at fault to the people who abused me, which again is preposterous, because attempting to wield that degree of power over another person's life necessarily means that you're robbing that person of some of their own agency and ability to express responsibility in that situation. So it's not reasonable, really, to expect the abuse victim to be equally responsible. I mean, certainly I can sit and say that my behavior during those times was very negative and didn't help my situation, but again, a very large part of why that was the case was because I was dealing with the tools that I had. And certainly you could say, well, abusers are also only dealing with the tools that they have. Like, they were and it was definitely the case that they were abused themselves when they were growing up. And as a result, I had great sympathy for them. I still do. Because, the abuse that I grew up with sometimes caused me to abuse others when I didn't know better. But, you can't just stay where you are. You do have to commit yourself to improvement and to therapy. And, I mean, for a long time, because I couldn't really talk about my problems, and I found that people were unsympathetic, I couldn't go and see a counselor. And in fact, I still won't, because I don't feel safe giving people that opportunity to get back inside my head again. What I find more helpful is things like cognitive behavioral therapy, and making myself socialize, sometimes even when I don't really feel like it or don't even really have the time. Cultivating a very wide range of different friendships, so that even if one group of people is activating the paranoia that I was raised to feel about all people, because again, that was another thing that happened. When I was growing up, I was programmed to perceive every single person I encountered as a threat. So even when I would meet people who could have possibly helped me, I didn't feel like I could ask them for help. And there is a very freakish extent to which that is still the case, where I have relatives who are less psychologically manipulative than the ones I'm currently living with, but I don't feel safe going to live with them because I'm fearful that they will turn out to be worse. Even though I consciously know that they're actually very nice people, it's that complicated thing where abuse can be so hard to deprogram yourself of. It's that deep and that profound, and it really affects a person. And that, like, in saying all of this, I'm not making excuses for myself. I'm still working to move forward. I'm still reading books and other resources to improve my mental health so that I can move on to the next stage. But that's the thing. It takes so much commitment, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. So it is so important to be patient with people, and to be willing to just sit down with them and explain, you know, even basic situations to them in a very normal, compassionate sort of way. Because frankly, I was so far from normal emotional development that I recently, like during lockdowns, I binge watched a whole lot of a children's TV program called It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. No, sorry, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, so that I could learn basic emotional skills. And I'm a 32-year-old woman. Like that's how pervasive abuse can be, that you sometimes don't learn basic emotional management skills until you're like, and these are skills that are being directed at like 4 or 5 year olds at best, and I'm learning them like 30 years too late. So, well, not too late, it's never too late to start leading a better life, leading a life with better integrity and better responsibility than the one you had before. But what I mean to say is it takes work and it takes time. And if you are an abuse victim, you have to give yourself the time and look at, okay, what are my problems? What can I do to improve them? What resources could I seek out at maybe the local library? That for me, that was a big boon. My family could control what was going on in my home, but if I went to the library and borrowed a DVD about about mental health and how to improve it, they couldn't really stop me from doing that. So, just look for little opportunities where you can sort of sneak around, you know. And currently, yes, I am still living with my parents. And I don't have plans to move away quickly. Mostly because financially it would be completely untenable, and in terms of career it would be untenable. And you could say, well, sure, no, you don't have to do your store. You could get a different job, but I know that psychologically I probably couldn't handle that. Emotionally and in terms of energy, I probably couldn't handle it. I think that what I need to do is to really focus on getting my business as good as it can be where it is, and save up gradually in order to be able to move away permanently and forever, instead of having to come back again the way that I did the last time I succeeded in moving away. And even just moving in with friends or relatives is not really an option anymore, because my business necessitates a certain amount of room in order to work. And yeah, I have been seeking other forms of work to supplement my income. It takes time. It takes time. It's a process for anybody. And again, for the people who have shown me support and understanding, I'm really grateful. I will never stop being grateful to you, because you have, permanently, modified the trajectory of my life. Like, not just who I am now, but who I'm going to be. And I'm thankful for that. And yeah. So, yeah, thank you.